Today we will focus on Francisco Suárez, a natural law theorist whose approach formed a basis for the assertion of individual rights and limitations of government, laying the ground for what is now referred to as international law. This is especially relevant now when the tenets of international law, especially state sovereignty, are currently the subject of radical debate, evident in the state actions in the Middle East. In his landmark work, De Legibus Acteo Legislatore, first published in 1612, Suarez dedicates the entire book to natural law discourse. Let's get into a background of Francisco Suárez before we analyze his natural law theory. Francisco Suárez was a Spanish Jesuit philosopher and theologian. He is widely regarded as the most significant scholastic thinker. This is the period of thought in which there were efforts to reconcile classical philosophy, especially Aristotelian philosophy, and Christianity. It's therefore the period between 1100 and 1700, and he's considered a significant scholastic thinker after St. Thomas Aquinas, whom we looked at in our previous episode. Suarez's systematic metaphysics and moral philosophy shaped early modern thought and influenced both international law and political theory. His major works include Disputationes Metaphysica, De Legibus, and Defensio Fidei Catholicae. He was nicknamed an exceptional and pious doctor. On his life and career, he studied law at the University of Salamanca in Spain before joining the Jesuits, which is a Catholic religious order, in the year 1564. Insofar as his philosophical contributions are concerned, in Disputationes Metaphysicae, which was his first comprehensive treatise on metaphysics, he tried to treat the subject independently of theology, and this served for centuries as a core textbook in both Catholic and Protestant schools. He also developed a distinct system from the Thomist approach from St. Thomas Aquinas, emphasizing a formal distinction between essence and existence, and also later had a large influence on theories such as René Descartes. On his political and legal thought, thanks to his monumental works, De Legibus and Defensio Fidei Catholicae, Suarez rejected the divine right of kings espoused by James I of England, arguing that sovereignty originates in the people and that legitimate government derives from social contract and consent. These views made him a precursor of modern natural law and human rights theory and a foundational figure in the development of international law. In comparison to St. Thomas Aquinas, Suarez departed from Aquinas in two important ways. First, with his emphasis on will versus reason as regards natural law. While Aquinas placed primary emphasis on reason as the basis for understanding moral law, being grounded in rational principles, Suarez gave greater weight to the will. So for Suarez, law is fundamentally an act of the will, specifically a command issued by a legitimate superior who is ultimately God. Another distinction is his understanding of nature. While Aquinas argued that what is natural for human beings is what accords with their rational nature, that is, which is reasonable, Suarez, by contrast, understood natural law as knowledge of the good derived from reflection of human nature itself. So moral norms arise from understanding what promotes human flourishing, though they remain grounded in divine authority. And why is this significant? It's significant because then he is able to provide a bridge between the medieval natural law and modern legal theory by trying to combine rational insight with law as authoritative command because of his emphasis on the aspect of the will. So Suarez formulated a rich and carefully structured theory of natural law that resists a simple classification. So in his attempt, he tried to ensure that natural law is not reduced either to pure intellectualism, which treats law merely as a rational truth grasped by the intellect, or to pure voluntarism, which understands law solely as a command imposed by the divine will. Instead, Suarez proposed a more nuanced framework in which reason and will are interconnected. In his view, natural law unfolds through four inseparable and mutually reinforcing dimensions. These are objectivity, knowledge, and obligation. Let's look at these dimensions one by one. So he explained natural law as being objective because it's single, unified, and it applies universally to all people, in all places, at all times, and under every condition of human existence. So its universality rests on the fact that natural law arises not from any particular historical situation or social arrangement, but from human nature itself in its essential form. So the foundation of natural law is rational human nature. I repeat that. The foundation of natural law is rational human nature. And because rational nature in the human person remains constant, natural law itself is fundamentally unchangeable. And then it's important to note that while he says that natural law is objective and universal in scope and therefore immutable, he says that while natural law is immutable in its core principles, it operates within the context of human circumstances. So human situations, cultures, conditions may vary, but the underlying rational structure of natural law does not change. So natural law recognizes the variability of the subject matter, which is human actions and social conditions, and therefore applies its principles in ways that are suited to each conditions. And how does this function? So in this adaptability in application, Suarez refers to what we call proximate principles or conclusions, and he prefers that as opposed to abstract universal principles alone. So for Suarez, a law, properly speaking, is a practical rule that directs action, and the most general moral principles only become true rules of conduct when they're concretely specified and applied to particular actions. So natural law thus moves from universal foundations to more specific moral directives that guide real human behavior. And this is important because then Suarez is able to ground moral norms or natural law in the essential features of rational human nature. He defends the claim that moral principles possess universal validity rather than shifting according to subjective or cultural variation. Then another element or another dimension of natural law which Suarez tries to explain is that there's knowledge, the importance of knowledge. He argues that insofar as law exists within the human person, it takes the form of an act of the intellect, reflecting the intention of the lawgiver. So law, properly speaking, expresses a general rule about what ought to be done, whereas what we refer to as conscience, and which many of us know, applies that rule to a concrete and particular situation. So the law provides universal moral guidance, while conscience delivers a practical judgment about a specific act. And although natural law does not explicitly mention God in its formulation, Suarez argues that human reason enables us to recognize that acting against natural law is ultimately acting against the creator of nature. So that is where knowledge is derived, through the natural light of reason, because we've talked about the first element of objectivity being the universality, universal scope, immutability, and adaptability. But all this is thanks to the natural light of reason. So through this light, individuals understand that moral disorder contradicts both human nature and its divine source. So his synthesis can be summarized as in terms of knowledge, that natural law is fundamentally knowable through reason. Human beings are capable of immediately grasping basic moral principles, such as the imperative to do good and to do evil, and from these foundational insights, more specific moral norms can be derived through rational reflection and analysis. So importantly, this knowledge is natural rather than dependent on divine revelation. And although natural law ultimately depends on God as its source, its principles are accessible to human reason without the need for revealed theology. So for Suarez, natural law thus constitutes a universal moral framework available to all rational persons by virtue of their shared human nature. Then in terms of the third dimension, Suarez departs also from Aquinas' approach by questioning the view that law is simply an act of the intellect, and this is where we are going to explain the place of the will. So while Suarez agrees that right reason is necessary, since one must first make a correct judgment about what ought to be done, he argues that intellectual judgment alone is not sufficient to constitute law. For law to exist in the proper sense, the will must also intervene and effectively direct action to what has been judged as good. So according to Suarez, a promulgated law exists in the mind of the subject and appears there as an act of understanding. However, this intellectual approach is not law in itself, and it needs actions. So the true essence of law lies in the act of the will, specifically in a command that then moves the subject towards action. So the law is not merely a rational instruction, but a binding directive grounded in legislative will. And for this reason, then, Suarez argues that natural law therefore becomes binding. It obliges because it ultimately has a supreme legislator, but then he does not reject the role of reason. Instead, he seeks to integrate both the rational and the volitional elements into a unified account. And in doing so, he provides a framework that anticipates later command theories of law, which we're going to look at in our future episodes, and this will be prominent especially in legal positivism and theories that build up on the legal positivist theories. Then lastly, on the last element, as regards natural law, Francisco argues on the obligation, that natural law carries a genuine moral obligation. So this obligation does not arise merely from recognizing rational truth, but it exists because God commands human beings to act in accordance with their rational nature. So while the content of natural law is grounded in reason, its moral authority ultimately depends on divine legislative power. And therefore, natural law combines rational content, divine authority, and then now this binding force. So the moral requirement to obey flows from the human will's orientation towards its proper ends, and humans are obliged to act in ways that are consistent with their nature and their ultimate purpose. So in summary, looking at those four dimensions that we have mentioned: objectivity, knowledge, the essence of natural law, and obligation, we can see Suarez, he preserves the objectivity, which is basically the place of human reason and the universal scope and of natural law, which is very central to the synthesis by St. Thomas Aquinas, which we looked at in our previous episode. But then he continues to influence later thinkers such as Hugo, because He represents a transitional position by trying now to integrate human nature, rational knowledge, basically legal reasoning, and the binding obligation into a comprehensive theory, but then also bringing out the important aspect of the will. Yeah. So for Suarez, natural law is neither merely moral realism nor solely divine command. Yeah, there's a gap that he tries to fill between the classical natural law theory and modern legal positivism, because he tries to connect the intellect and the will, so to speak, and therefore trying to connect also the place of human nature and also the place of command. Yeah, and this is important because he's an early natural law theorist, and just like other early natural law theorists, Suarez focused on the question of what legislators, what citizens, what governments ought to do according to reason and conscience. Yeah, so their method was rooted in ethical and political reflection, examining the nature and the purpose of law itself, rather than treating law as a subject for modern social, scientific, or positivist analysis. Yeah, and to fully understand their works, like I keep repeating, you must consider it within the historical and philosophical context, and not just through contemporary analytical frameworks. Yeah. So in his framework, we can see Suarez then provides a foundation for human rights, because moral obligations and basic rights therefore can be seen to arise from a shared human nature rather than from a positive law that is made by a certain authority. And then also we see that his arguments support the idea that political authority originates in community and then it's delegated to rulers. Yeah, and this therefore provides an anticipation for principles such as popular sovereignty and constitutional democracy. So one of the largest impact of Suarez's work can be attributed to Hugo Grotius, who is considered the father of modern day international law. So his work had a significant impact on Hugo Grotius, whose writings laid the foundations for modern international law. But then Grotius did not emphasize the role of the will in law. Instead, he focused on rules grounded in reason that define what governments may legitimately do and how nations may properly interact with one another. So Grotius argued that natural law, being based on reason, would remain valid, yeah, even in the absence of God, yeah, like Suarez had argued before. And by highlighting the limits on government authority and recognizing individual rights, he also then developed a framework for a secular conception of natural law, which paved the way for later liberal natural rights theorists. Yeah, and his key principles, the key principles of Grotius, which then built from Suarez, are that natural law has a rational foundation, its rules are necessary for peaceful coexistence and ethical governance, and therefore international law arises from natural law, which then governs relations between states as well as individuals. Yeah, so the moral and legal norms of natural law are binding because they are rationally necessary, not merely because they are divinely commanded. And here we see then Grotius extended natural law theory to address both individual behavior and international relations, demonstrating its universal and rational character. So we see that Francisco Suárez played a pivotal role in the systematic grounding of natural law in the enduring structure of rational human nature. He is often called the bridge between medieval and modern philosophy because he combined Thomistic scholasticism with ideas that anticipated modern natural law, international law, and political theory. And he influenced secular thought, yeah? Even though he was a Catholic theologian, his ideas on natural law and sovereignty influenced secular thinkers and helped shape modern concepts of human rights and democratic governance. So Suarez can be described as a philosopher, a constitutional theorist, an international human rights predecessor and thinker, and a scholar whose work bridges ethics, law, and politics on a global scale. That brings us to the end of today's episode. If you enjoyed the episode or have any comments or questions, please feel free to share them using our contact details. And references of text used for this episode will be provided in the description text. If you enjoyed the episode, also don't forget to like, to subscribe, and hit the notification button for our next episode. See you then.